In every relationship, there are conversations we avoid, truths we keep buried because speaking them out loud feels too dangerous, and resentments that build silently beneath the surface of our daily routines. But sometimes life puts us in situations where the truth demands to be spoken, where staying silent becomes more painful than the risk of confrontation, and where the facade we've been maintaining finally cracks under the weight of what's left unsaid. This is the story of how one woman's moment of raw honesty during a seemingly innocent game show question exposed the dysfunction in her marriage, how her husband's reaction revealed deeper issues than anyone expected, and how that public moment of reckoning became the catalyst for understanding what it really means to be partners instead of just people living in the same house. Before we dive into this powerful story about communication, partnership, and the courage it takes to demand the respect you deserve, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what you're about to witness is a reminder that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to pretend everything is fine when it's not. The Martinez family from Phoenix, Arizona walked onto the Family Feud stage in January 2025 with the kind of polished appearance that suggested they had their lives completely together. Leading the family was 39-year-old Elena Martinez, an immigration attorney with sharp intelligence visible in her eyes and a controlled smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. Beside her stood her husband of 14 years, 42-year-old Carlos Martinez, a real estate developer who carried himself with the confident swagger of someone used to being the center of attention. They were joined by Elena's younger sister Sofia, Carlos's older brother Miguel, and Elena's college best friend Jasmine, who had known the couple since they first started dating. During the pre-show interviews, the production staff noticed something interesting about the family dynamic. When asked about their marriage, Carlos dominated the conversation, talking about his successful business, their beautiful home, their upcoming vacation to Cabo, all the material markers of a successful life. Elena stood beside him nodding and smiling, but her body language was tense, her jaw tight, and her responses when she did speak were brief and careful. Sofia, Elena's sister, watched the interaction with barely concealed frustration, and Jasmine kept shooting Elena concerned glances that suggested she knew something was wrong beneath the surface. What the production team didn't know, what would soon become painfully obvious to millions of viewers, was that Elena and Carlos's marriage had been crumbling for the past 3 years. The problems hadn't started with any dramatic betrayal or single catastrophic event, but rather with the slow erosion of partnership and respect that happens when one person stops seeing their spouse as an equal and starts treating them as a supporting character in their own story. Carlos had always been ambitious and driven, qualities that Elena had admired when they first met. But somewhere along the way, his ambition had curdled into arrogance, his confidence had become dismissiveness, and his natural leadership had transformed into controlling behavior that left Elena feeling invisible in her own marriage. The issues were insidious in their subtlety. Carlos made major financial decisions without consulting Elena, even though she contributed equally to their household income. He dismissed her opinions in front of friends and family, often interrupting her to correct what she was saying or to finish her sentences with what he thought she meant to say. He scheduled social events, vacations, and even home renovations without asking for her input, then acted hurt and confused when she expressed frustration at not being included in decisions that affected her life. When Elena tried to talk to him about feeling dismissed and disrespected, Carlos would say she was being too sensitive, that she was overreacting, that he was just trying to take care of things so she wouldn't have to worry about them. He framed his controlling behavior as thoughtfulness, his dismissiveness as efficiency, and his refusal to treat her as an equal partner as him, being the man of the house. Elena, exhausted from fighting and worn down by years of having her concerns minimized, had largely stopped trying to address the issues directly. Instead, she threw herself into her work as an immigration attorney, finding fulfillment in advocating for her clients since she couldn't seem to advocate effectively for herself in her own marriage. She confided in Sofia and Jasmine, both of whom had been urging her for months to either go to marriage counseling or seriously consider whether this marriage was worth saving. But Elena, like many people in slowly deteriorating relationships, kept hoping things would get better, kept telling herself that this was just a rough patch, kept finding reasons to avoid the hard conversations that needed to happen. The Family Feud appearance had been Carlos's idea, something he'd arranged without really asking Elena if she wanted to do it. He'd applied for them to be on the show, coordinated the schedules, picked the family members who would participate, and presented it all to Elena as a done deal. When she'd expressed some hesitation, saying she wasn't sure she wanted their family on national television, Carlos had dismissed her concerns, saying it would be fun, and that she needed to loosen up and not be so serious all the time. Elena had agreed because fighting about it seemed more exhausting than just going along, a dynamic that had become the pattern in their relationship. But standing on that stage, with cameras pointed at her and an audience watching, something shifted inside Elena. Maybe it was the public setting that gave her courage. Maybe it was the accumulation of years of frustration finally reaching a breaking point. Or maybe she was just tired of performing the role of the happy wife when the reality was so different. Whatever the reason, Elena arrived at the Family Feud studio with a different energy than she'd had in years. A simmering determination that Sophia and Jasmine recognized, and that made them both nervous and hopeful. The game started smoothly enough, with both families engaged and competitive. Steve Harvey went through his usual charm offensive, getting to know the families and creating the fun atmosphere that made the show beloved. When he talked to Elena and Carlos, he asked the standard questions about their marriage, and Carlos, true to form, took over the conversation. He talked about how he'd known Elena was the one from the moment he met her, how they'd built a great life together, how lucky he was to have such a smart and beautiful wife. Elena stood beside him with that same controlled smile, and Steve, with his years of reading people, noticed something in her expression that made him pause, a tightness around her eyes, a stiffness in her posture that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with Carlos's narrative. The first few rounds went well, with both families giving good answers and the competition staying close. Carlos was loud and enthusiastic, celebrating every point, high-fiving his brother Miguel, and playing to the cameras with practiced ease. Elena was quieter but sharp, giving excellent answers when it was her turn, though Carlos often interrupted her to help by adding to her responses or suggesting better answers even after she'd already spoken. The third time he interrupted her, Steve noticed and gently said, "Brother, let your wife finish her thought. She's doing great." Carlos laughed it off, but the audience had started to notice the pattern, and some people were making uncomfortable sounds at his behavior. The turning point came in the fourth round when Steve asked a question that would change everything. The question was, "Name something your spouse does that drives you crazy." It was a classic Family Feud question designed to get humorous, relatable answers about annoying habits like leaving dishes in the sink, snoring, or taking too long to get ready. The answers were supposed to be lighthearted and fun, the kind of minor irritations that every couple deals with. Elena was at the podium for this question, and she buzzed in quickly. But instead of giving one of the expected humorous answers, instead of playing it safe with something about leaving the toilet seat up or forgetting to take out the trash, Elena looked directly at Carlos and said something that stopped the entire studio cold. "Makes every decision without asking me," she said, her voice clear and steady and completely serious. The board revealed that, yes, it was the number 3 answer with 19 points. Apparently enough people surveyed had the same complaint. But this was clearly not a joke for Elena, not a lighthearted observation about a minor annoyance. This was a truth bomb delivered with surgical precision, and everyone in the studio felt the shift in energy. Carlos's smile faltered, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. Steve Harvey's eyebrows went up in that trademark expression, and he looked between Elena and Carlos with dawning recognition that something real was happening here. Before Steve could say anything, before the moment could be smoothed over and the game could continue, Elena kept talking, the words flowing out after years of being held back. "He planned this whole Family Feud thing without asking me if I wanted to do it. He makes financial decisions without consulting me even though I make my own money. He interrupts me constantly, even in front of all of you, even on national television, because he doesn't think what I have to say is as important as what he wants to say. And I am tired of pretending it's fine when it's not." The studio fell into shocked silence, the kind of profound quiet that happens when people witness something unexpected and intensely personal. Carlos's face went from red to pale, his jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Sophia and Jasmine both looked like they wanted to applaud but were holding themselves back, clearly having heard these complaints from Elena many times in private, and relieved that she was finally saying them publicly. Miguel looked uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to his brother and recognition that Elena wasn't wrong. Steve Harvey, to his credit, didn't try to make a joke or deflect the tension. Instead, he walked over to where Elena stood at the podium and spoke to her with genuine concern. Elena, it sounds like you've been holding this in for a while. Do you want to talk about what's really going on here? Elena took a deep breath, and the cameras captured every emotion crossing her face, years of frustration, hurt, anger, and exhaustion, but also determination and strength. I love my husband, she said, but I don't like who he's become or maybe who he's always been, and I just didn't want to see it. I'm a successful attorney. I argue cases in front of judges. I advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves. But in my own marriage, I can't seem to get my husband to treat me like an equal partner instead of an accessory to his life. Carlos, his embarrassment curdling into defensive anger, interrupted her, which only proved her point. Elena, this is not the time or place for this conversation. You're embarrassing me in front of all these people. Steve held up his hand, his voice firm. Brother, did you hear what you just said? She's trying to tell you how she feels, and your concern is about being embarrassed. Not about her feelings, not about your marriage, but about how this makes you look. Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but Steve wasn't finished. And you just interrupted her again, even after she specifically said that interrupting her is one of the things that drives her crazy. Do you see the pattern here? The audience murmured in agreement, and Carlos looked around, perhaps expecting support but finding instead a sea of faces that were clearly on Elena's side. His face hardened, his pride wounded, and his control over the narrative slipping away. I don't have to stand here and be attacked by my own wife on national television, Carlos said, his voice rising. I work hard to provide for our family. I've given her a great life, and this is how she repays me. By humiliating me in front of millions of people. Elena's response was calm but devastating. Carlos, I don't need you to provide for me. I have my own career, my own income, my own success. What I needed was a partner, someone who valued my input and treated me with respect. But instead, I got someone who sees me as a trophy wife instead of an actual human being with thoughts and feelings and opinions that matter. The truth of her words hung in the air, and Carlos, faced with a moment that required humility and self-reflection, made the worst possible choice. Instead of listening, instead of acknowledging Elena's pain, instead of taking responsibility for his behavior, he chose his ego over his marriage. I'm done with this, he said, his voice cold and hard. I'm not going to stand here and be disrespected like this. You want to air our dirty laundry on TV? Fine. You can explain to everyone why our marriage is falling apart. And with that, Carlos Martinez walked off the Family Feud stage, leaving his wife, his family, and a shocked audience behind. The studio erupted in gasps and exclamations, some people calling out for him to come back, others applauding Elena for speaking her truth. Steve Harvey stood in the center of the stage, looking genuinely stunned, having witnessed many dramatic moments in his hosting career, but rarely seeing someone actually walk out on their spouse on national television. Elena stood at the podium, and instead of looking devastated or panicked, she looked almost relieved, like a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Sophia and Jasmine rushed to her side, wrapping her in supportive hugs, and Miguel stood awkwardly, clearly torn between following his brother and staying with the family. Steve, recovering from his shock, walked over to Elena and her family, his expression serious and compassionate. Elena, are you okay? He asked gently. She nodded, tears forming in her eyes, but her voice steady. I'm okay. Actually, I'm better than I've been in a long time. I finally said what I've needed to say for years, and his response, walking out instead of listening, that tells me everything I need to know about our marriage. Steve looked at the cameras, then back at Elena, making a decision about how to handle this unprecedented situation. We're going to take a break, he announced. Elena, I want to talk to you and your family privately for a few minutes. The game can wait. What's happening here is more important than any points or prizes. The production paused, and Steve brought Elena, Sophia, Jasmine, and Miguel to a quieter area of the studio, away from the audience but with cameras still rolling because Steve recognized that what was happening here was important, not just for Elena, but for millions of people watching who might see themselves in her story. Elena, talk to me, Steve said once they were settled. How long has it been like this? Elena took a deep breath and began to unpack years of accumulated frustration and hurt. It started small, she explained. Little things, like him ordering for me at restaurants without asking what I wanted, or making weekend plans without checking if I was available. I thought it was sweet at first, that he was being thoughtful and taking charge. But it got bigger and more frequent until I realized I had almost no say in my own life. She described specific examples, how Carlos had bought them a new car without consulting her, how he'd committed them to hosting his entire family for Christmas without asking if she wanted to, how he'd made a major investment using their joint savings without discussing it with her first. Each example on its own might have seemed like a minor issue, but together, they painted a picture of a marriage where one person made all the decisions and the other person's role was simply to go along with them. Sophia spoke up, her voice passionate. I've been watching this for years, watching my brilliant, accomplished sister shrink herself smaller and smaller to fit into Carlos's idea of what a wife should be. She stopped expressing opinions around him because he'd dismissed them. She stopped talking about her work accomplishments because he'd changed the subject to his own success. She became a ghost in her own marriage. Jasmine added her perspective. I've known them since college, and Elena used to be so confident, so vibrant, so full of life. Watching her with Carlos over the years has been like watching someone slowly disappear. I kept hoping she'd wake up and realize she deserved better, and I think today, finally, she did. Miguel, Carlos's brother, looked uncomfortable but spoke honestly. I love my brother, but I've seen how he treats Elena, and it's not right. He does the same thing to our mother, to his female colleagues, to any woman really. He doesn't see women as equals. He sees them as supporting characters in his story. I've tried to talk to him about it, but he doesn't listen. Steve listened to all of this, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When they finished, he addressed Elena directly. Elena, I want you to hear something important. What you described is not just poor communication or different personalities. What you described is a pattern of controlling behavior, of dismissing your autonomy, of treating you as less than an equal partner. That's not healthy, and it's not what marriage is supposed to be. He continued, his voice gentle but firm. A real partnership means both people have equal say in decisions that affect both of them. It means both people's opinions are valued and considered. It means both people feel heard and respected. What you've been experiencing is not partnership. It's one person making all the rules and expecting the other person to follow them. Elena nodded, tears flowing now. I know, I've known for a while, but I kept hoping he'd change, kept thinking if I just communicated better or if I picked the right time to talk to him, he'd finally hear me and things would get better. But they never did. Steve asked the question that needed to be asked. So what happens now? Where do you go from here? Elena took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and decisive. I think my marriage is over. Carlos walking out instead of staying to listen, choosing his pride over our relationship that showed me he's not willing or able to be the partner I need. And I'm done trying to make someone value me who clearly doesn't. Steve looked at her with respect and compassion. That's a hard decision to make, especially in such a public way. Are you sure? Elena smiled through her tears. I've never been more sure of anything. These past few years have been exhausting, and I didn't realize how exhausted I was until right now, standing here having finally told the truth. I feel lighter, freer, like I can finally breathe. That tells me everything I need to know. Steve turned to the cameras, recognizing that this moment had significance beyond just Elena's personal situation. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is a woman finding her voice after years of being silenced, a woman choosing herself after years of making herself small, and a woman having the courage to walk away from a relationship that wasn't serving her. This is not just a family feud moment. This is a life-changing moment, and I think we all need to pay attention to what it's teaching us. He addressed the broader issues at play. In too many relationships, one person dominates while the other person accommodates. One person makes all the decisions while the other person just goes along. One person's needs and wants and opinions matter while the other person's get dismissed or ignored. And we've normalized this, especially in marriages where the man is expected to be the head of the household, and the woman is expected to be submissive and supportive no matter what. Steve's voice grew more passionate. But that's not partnership, that's not love, and that's not what marriage is supposed to be. Real love elevates both people, real partnership values both voices, and real marriage means both people have equal say in building the life they share. If one person is making all the decisions, that's not a marriage, that's a dictatorship. The audience, which had been silent during this conversation, erupted in applause, many people standing to show their support for Elena and for Steve's message. After a 20-minute break, Steve made an announcement to the studio audience. Carlos had left the building entirely, refusing to come back or to speak with producers. The game would continue with Elena and her remaining family members, and the Chen family, their opponents, had graciously agreed to continue despite the unusual circumstances. The second half of the game had a completely different energy than the first. Elena, no longer weighed down by the pretense of marital happiness, was sharp, funny, confident, and engaged. She gave excellent answers, laughed genuinely, celebrated enthusiastically with Sophia and Jasmine, and seemed like a completely different person than the tense, controlled woman who had walked onto the stage an hour earlier. The transformation was so visible that Steve commented on it during a break in the action. Elena, I have to say, you seem like a completely different person than you were at the start of this game. Do you feel different? Elena smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. I feel free. I feel like I just set down a 100-pound backpack I'd been carrying for years. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending trying to keep the peace, trying not to upset Carlos, trying to be the perfect wife he wanted instead of being myself. Not having to do that anymore, it's like I can finally be me again. The Martinez family ended up winning the game, and Elena played fast money, scoring enough points to win the $20,000. When Steve announced their victory and the confetti fell, Elena broke down crying, but they were tears of relief and joy and liberation, not sadness. Her family surrounded her in celebration, and the audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the taping concluded, Steve asked Elena if she would be willing to come back in a few months to do a follow-up segment about her journey. She agreed, saying that if her story could help other women recognize unhealthy patterns in their own relationships, it would be worth the vulnerability of sharing it publicly. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with reactions, the vast majority supportive of Elena's courage in speaking her truth. The hashtag #ElenaSpeaks went viral, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of being dismissed or controlled in their relationships, of feeling invisible in their own marriages, of finally finding the courage to demand the respect they deserved. Relationship therapists and domestic violence advocates praised the way the episode had illustrated emotional abuse and controlling behavior, using it as an educational tool to help people recognize unhealthy relationship dynamics. Marriage counselors reported increased requests for help from couples dealing with similar issues, and divorce attorneys reported consultations from people who had recognized themselves in Elena's story and decided they deserved better. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from men who watched the episode and saw themselves in Carlos's behavior, who realized they had been dismissing their partner's voices and making unilateral decisions, and who reached out for help to change those patterns before they destroyed their own marriages. Several wrote to the show saying that watching Carlos walk out and lose his wife had been a wake-up call that motivated them to start treating their partners as true equals. 6 months after the original taping, Elena returned to Family Feud for the promised follow-up segment. She arrived looking radiant, confident, and at peace, accompanied by Sophia and Jasmine. Steve welcomed her warmly and asked her to share what the past 6 months had been like. "It's been the hardest and most liberating 6 months of my life," Elena began. "I filed for divorce 2 weeks after the show aired. Carlos tried to reconcile at first, but his version of reconciliation was me apologizing for embarrassing him and agreeing to go back to how things were. When I told him that wasn't acceptable, that I needed fundamental changes in how he treated me, he refused. He said I was the one with the problem, that I'd changed and wasn't the woman he married, and that if I wasn't willing to be a supportive wife, he didn't want to try." She continued, "And you know what? He was right about one thing. I'm not the woman he married, or rather, I'm not the woman I'd forced myself to become to fit his expectations. I'm the woman I was before I met him, before I started shrinking myself to make him comfortable. And that woman is strong, accomplished, confident, and unwilling to accept being treated as less than an equal." Elena shared that the divorce had been contentious, with Carlos fighting her on almost everything out of spite rather than genuine disagreement. But she had held firm on her boundaries, had refused to engage with his attempts to manipulate or control her even through the divorce process, and was in the final stages of having everything settled. She had also started therapy to work through the patterns that had allowed her to accept dismissive treatment for so long, to understand why she'd ignored her own needs for years, and to develop healthier relationship skills for the future. "The biggest thing I learned," Elena said, "is that I'd confused accommodation with love, compromise with self-sacrifice, and keeping the peace with losing myself. I thought being a good wife meant going along with whatever my husband wanted, but what I actually needed was a husband who cared what I wanted in the first place." Steve asked about her professional life and personal well-being. Elena smiled widely. "I got promoted at my firm 3 months ago. I'm leading our immigration rights initiative, doing work that matters and that I'm passionate about. I've reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with because Carlos didn't like them. I've taken up painting again, something I loved in college but gave up because Carlos thought it was a waste of time. And I'm happy, genuinely happy, in a way I haven't been in years." Jasmine and Sophia both spoke about witnessing Elena's transformation. "It's like getting my sister back," Sophia said. "The real Elena, not the muted, careful version who was always walking on eggshells. She laughs more, she's more spontaneous, she's more herself. Watching her come back to life has been incredible. Steve asked the question many viewers wanted answered. Have you heard from Carlos since the divorce proceedings started? Elena nodded. He sent messages, mostly blaming me for destroying our marriage by airing our problems publicly, saying I humiliated him and ruined his reputation. He still doesn't understand that he destroyed our marriage long before we walked onto this stage, that I just finally had the courage to say it out loud. He's the victim in his own narrative, which tells me I made the right decision. Steve turned to the camera with an important message. I want everyone watching to pay attention to what Elena just said. In unhealthy relationships, when you set a boundary or stand up for yourself, the other person often positions themselves as the victim. They make it about how you embarrass them, how you hurt them, how you're the problem, instead of taking accountability for the behavior that led to you speaking up in the first place. He continued, his voice passionate. If your partner dismisses your feelings, makes every decision without your input, interrupts you constantly, treats your opinions as less important than theirs, and then gets angry when you point it out, that person is not your partner. That person is your controller, and you deserve better. Steve shared practical advice for viewers in similar situations. If you see yourself in Elena's story, if you're in a relationship where you feel unheard, invisible, or dismissed, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, and you're not overreacting. Those are things controlling people say to make you doubt yourself. Trust your feelings, trust your instincts, and know that you have the right to be treated with respect and to have your voice valued in your own relationship. He also addressed people who might see themselves in Carlos's behavior. And if you recognized yourself in Carlos, if you realized watching this that you make decisions without consulting your partner, that you dismiss their opinions, that you interrupt them or talk over them, that you see them as support staff in your life instead of as an equal partner, I want you to know that you can change. But it requires genuine humility, real self-reflection, and a willingness to share power and control instead of hoarding it. If you're willing to do that work, get help, talk to a therapist, read books about healthy relationships, and most importantly, start listening, really listening to what your partner has been trying to tell you. Elena shared one final powerful message. To any woman watching who feels stuck in a relationship where she's not valued, where her voice doesn't matter, where she's made herself small to accommodate someone else's ego, I want you to know that you can leave. It's scary, it's hard, there will be people who judge you or who think you should have tried harder or stayed longer. But your life is yours, not theirs, and you deserve to live it as your full, authentic self, not as a diminished version designed to make someone else comfortable. The segment concluded with Steve announcing that Elena had partnered with several women's organizations to create workshops about recognizing unhealthy relationship dynamics, setting boundaries, and rebuilding after leaving controlling relationships. She was using her legal skills and her personal experience to help other women navigate divorce from controlling partners and to advocate for themselves effectively. The response to Elena's follow-up was even more powerful than the response to the original episode. Thousands of women reached out sharing that Elena's story had given them the courage to leave their own unhealthy relationships, to demand respect from their partners, or to recognize patterns they'd been ignoring. Support groups for people leaving controlling relationships reported increased attendance, and domestic violence resources saw surges in calls and contacts. 1 year after Carlos walked off the Family Feud stage, a documentary was made about the cultural impact of Elena's moment of truth-telling. It featured interviews with relationship experts, therapists, and dozens of women who had been inspired by Elena's courage to make changes in their own lives. The documentary explored the concept of emotional abuse and controlling behavior in relationships, using Elena and Carlos's story as a case study for how these dynamics develop and why they're so damaging. Elena appeared in the documentary, now thriving in her independence and serving as a powerful advocate for women's rights and healthy relationships. She had started dating someone new, a fellow attorney who treated her as an equal partner, who valued her opinions, and who understood that love means elevating each other, not diminishing one person to elevate the other. She spoke about how different healthy love felt compared to what she'd had with Carlos, how being truly valued and respected changed everything. The documentary also included an unexpected element, an interview with Carlos, who had agreed to participate after a year of therapy and self-reflection. He spoke candidly about his behavior, taking genuine accountability in a way he hadn't been able to do when Elena first confronted him. Watching that episode back, seeing how I treated Elena, how I dismissed her and interrupted her and made everything about me, it was devastating, Carlos admitted. I'd always thought of myself as a good husband because I provided financially, because I was faithful, because I didn't hit her. But I was emotionally abusive, I was controlling, and I destroyed my marriage through 1,000 small disrespects that added up to her finally having enough. He explained that losing Elena, losing his marriage in such a public way, and facing the overwhelming public criticism had forced him to confront truths about himself he'd been avoiding his entire life. He'd started therapy, joined a men's group focused on healthy masculinity and respectful relationships, and was working to unlearn the toxic patterns he'd learned from his own father and from cultural messages about men needing to dominate in relationships. "I can't undo the damage I did to Elena," Carlos said. "I can't get those years back or change how I treated her. All I can do is make sure I never treat another partner that way. And maybe by sharing my story, I can help other men recognize these patterns in themselves before they lose the people they love like I did." The documentary ended with a powerful montage of Elena's journey from the tense, controlled woman at the start of the Family Feud episode to the confident, empowered advocate she had become, set to interviews with dozens of women, sharing how her courage had inspired their own transformations. Before we close this remarkable story, I need you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like Elena's remind us that speaking our truth is always worth it, that we teach people how to treat us by what we're willing to accept, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is refuse to shrink to make someone else comfortable. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about the importance of equal partnerships and mutual respect in relationships. And remember that you deserve to be with someone who values your voice, respects your autonomy, treats you as an equal partner, and would never walk away from a hard conversation instead of listening to how you feel. Elena Martinez walked onto a game show stage expecting to play a game, but she walked away having reclaimed her life, her voice, and her sense of self-worth. That moment when she chose honesty over pretense, when she chose herself over keeping the peace, when she chose truth over comfort, that changed not just her life but the lives of thousands of women who saw their own struggles reflected in her courage. The real prize wasn't the $20,000 she won. It was the freedom to be fully herself again, and that's priceless. Your voice matters, your feelings are valid, your needs are important, and you deserve a partner who treats you like the equal you are. Never forget that, and never settle for less.